on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Hollywood Already Did It, your movie podcast for reboots, remakes, and sequels, and trying to figure out why it was relevant then and why it might be relevant now, or if it missed the mark on finding its audience. As always, I'm your host, Blake Schultz, and with me is Terrence Tatum.
Hello, everyone.
And we are getting into a movie that goes all the way back to Disney's original roots, the 1937 Snow White movie, which their first animated movie, it paid for their Burbank lot. It saved the studio. The historical impact for Disney alone for this movie is wildly important. And it now joins the ranks of its plethora of live action remakes, many of which I have already forgotten came out and that we talked about because we've been doing this so long.
Yeah.
And I feel like we keep being like, but why? So let's do it again. Terrence, what did you think of Snow White?
Wow. Um, let's start here. I'm going to start with the positives because I think that's always a good foot to sort of land on. I think Rachel Ziegler, who the lead of Snow White, does a pretty good job of sort of modernizing to the best of the script allows her to a Snow White for today's ages. They add a little bit of pluckiness to her, more than I think anything that 1937 version had, because it's antiquated, which that's a part of the charm of that story. But I think they do a pretty good job of updating her, giving her a couple songs. I think all the songs that they add are not memorable at all. Like I'd forgotten them before I left the theater. But I think the performances, she does well as singing. She has a good voice. She sings well. Amidst some really odd directing choices that I just could not fully get behind. The biggest one that sort of glares out to me is the Seven Dwarfs being as stylized as they are with these CG things when nothing else in the film operates in that manner. Everything else is real to the point where there is an actual little person in the movie. And I'm like, well, why is he here? But you couldn't just do that with the dwarfs. Like my brain just couldn't wrap itself around that. And that's an actual choice that is made. Um, I I don't have a problem with the updating sort of pieces that you have with making her more modern and give her a little bit more onus, saying that she's not so much at the whim of the prince if the story fleshed it out more. It's just like basically two, maybe three scenes that are sort of just added that don't really add anything to the story. And so it's kind of just weighs down or takes away from the actual charm that Snow White should have. There is no charm in this movie. And that's partly because of the directing, but I also think for Snow White to be as hopeful and full of charm, you have to have an antagonist that gives her that onus or that push. And I'm going to do my best to not crap on Gal too much, but there is a lot of charisma that is missing from the antagonist in this movie. The evil queen just does not work on any level to me. I don't feel fearful of her. I don't feel afraid for her. And honestly, most of the time when Gal is on screen, I chuckle because I feel like there is a bit of a soullessness that happens where I think this movie needs that character of all other characters in this movie to probably be the most on 10 or getting that feeling across. Similar to like if I'm watching Maleficent, I know Angelina Jolie, she's killing it. Whereas here I'm just kind of like I am watching paint dry. And it just makes the rest of the film feel anything that's going good just drops 10 points.
It, it reminds me, and I know these movies have fans, and frankly, I'm one of them, but it reminds me of like the Star Wars prequels where you're just clearly watching like an Oscar award-winning actor work off of like a tennis ball.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, we all know that Liam Neeson is
Right. Is
better than
than
this.
this. Correct.
Um, yeah, I'm with you. There were, it's funny. There were a lot of things that I liked in the movie, which is why it's really hard for me to pinpoint all the reasons why it doesn't work. But and I really did think that Rachel Zegler was good in the role. I really liked her. I didn't mind. the performances of the dwarves, but they do just look weird.
Yeah.
It looks like small soldiers coming to life. Like if they made like a Hot Toys Small Soldiers movie and you
Yeah.
had these hyper realistic action figures, and sometimes they just reminded me straight up of like the Norwegian trolls that like my aunt and her mom would have that
Especially
terrified
Dopey
me at
that were like
holidays.
frightening. Yeah.
Yeah. And I couldn't like figure, and I kept trying to remember all the different controversies while we were watching the movie because I was trying to be like, so what led to this? Because I know first it was we're dropping the seven dwarfs from the title, which fine. I don't, it's synonymous. I don't think anyone's ever been like, no, it's Snow White, and I don't think
Yeah.
that's ever been the case. I know for a while they were like, we're not going to cast little people, we're going to cast all of these other people, and that's where we're going to find all of our other people of color and roles that we
Hmm.
need to have. And then Peter Dinklage, rightfully so, was like, okay, but then you just took away seven roles from a marginalized community that never has roles. What did he call it? He called it like a bastardization of like of trying to do the right thing. It was like you're trying so hard, but you're just failing.
But you're failing. Yeah.
Um, and then, of course, they had all the people who are just going to be mad to be mad.
Hmm.
And I disagree with all of the like right wing commentators who are like, it's woke, because it's really not that
It's not.
woke,
It's not.
if at all. So I feel like they recast real little people for the dwarves, I think is what happened. And then they were like, well, now people want the dwarves to look like how they remember them looking, whether it's from this movie or in Kingdom Hearts or wherever.
Wherever. Yeah.
So let's do that.
But superimpose a CG.
And then I feel like they learned all the wrong lessons from The Lion King, because then you also have these like woodland animals, which are so majestic in the first Snow White and such a part of the world. And they're coming in and she's whistling with the blue jay, and it's fun and whimsical. But now you have her and then this like overtly cartoon deer with this overtly hyper real dwarf person
And those three things
amalgamation. You know what
don't mesh.
you know what they look like? Do you remember when like I don't know, MySpace and Facebook first kind of came out and everyone did those like here's what Peter Griffin would look like if he was real. And here's
Yes.
what all
And like The
they
Simpsons, yeah, like with
yeah,
Homer, yeah, yeah.
yeah, they all look like what if we made this real? And it was always terrifying.
It was
And
so
it
scary.
was
Yeah.
always the worst. That's what this reminds me of. And they're so static. Like they don't really
Hmm.
move,
No.
but then all the animals kind of do. And it feels like there's three different art styles
Correct.
like battling to
There's no
exist in
flow.
this
There's no
space.
flow to it at all. You kind of just like, I don't know how we got here with these three different versions. Yeah.
Because even the gems in the mines that are like they all look like fruity pebbles, and for some
Hmm.
reason that also kept. I was like, well, oh, like I don't. They're so bright, and the rest of this world is so not.
Yeah.
And I don't. And it works in animation. It works really well there because it sets a different tone, and there's such like a you're brought into this fantasy world, and then you go into these mines, and there's these bright colors, and then the witch gets these dark, evil, crazy moments, and the mirror has these smoke effects. And
Hmm.
like, and it's why the movie is still awesome. Because it really was like, here's what Disney's going to be able to do. We're going to
Right.
pull you into a fantasy where everything's perfect and then show you some of the scariest stuff you've ever seen. And then we're going to fight that. And instead, in this, you have Gal Gadot, who's just kind of like covered in rings and it just at every moment is just like mad that someone's like pretty, I guess. And I know
Yeah.
that that's the movie, but like it doesn't quite gel here as well to me.
Yeah, part of it because it's done in real life, so like it doesn't work as well. Like you can buy a queen sort of feeling that way in an animated form, but I also think I just feel like the voice work that happened in the original Snow White conveyed the feeling of like, am I the fairest of the land? Far more than whatever we got from Gal. Like I didn't believe her above all of the
Yeah.
things. And that I think that's the biggest piece. So even when she breaks out into song, the song is bad. She's not doing it well. And it's just like, I don't. I don't believe anything that's happening on the screen. And thus, because I don't believe her, I then don't believe her guards. I don't believe any, like it has a trickle effect on anybody else that's sort of associated with what she is doing. And so it starts feeling like, oh, we're now just going through the beats of Snow White because the person that I'm supposed to believe, like, oh yeah, we're gonna get to this point where she's got to make a potion, she's got to put an apple in it, we got to get the poison apple. Like we're going through the beats because that's what Snow White is, not because I believe anything that this character is doing.
Yeah, and we tried really hard to like update some of the stuff with the huntsman and the prince,
Hmm.
and so much of that old movie dealt with these like pretty, I don't want to say simple themes, but like easy enough themes of jealousy and vanity. And here's what's going to fuel her. And whenever something doesn't go her way, she's mad about it. And like we kind of see how that makes her cruel. But in this one, whenever she's jealous, she's just sort of like it. She's never really mean to anybody. She's just sort of like, what are you talking about? I have the jewels, though. Like she doesn't believe the mirror when it tells her this. And so, like, any jealousy she seems to have doesn't feel real. Because instead of her just being like, there's somebody better than me, I got to go kill her and cut her heart out. She's like, well, that doesn't make sense. I have these rings on, and the gems are what makes me beautiful. So screw all that. Um, so I think it's very interesting that that doesn't get reflected as well in live action. And then even her like transformation into the old woman doesn't feel quite as like as scary either. Like it just feels very tame when you get to that moment. Um, and I think that hurts a lot of those bigger themes because then you don't really get to see Snow White survive that and still remain herself and remain
Hmm.
this like innocent, kind person because we just know everyone's okay. Like even right at the jump when she's like steal everything and tie him out there to freeze, and then we go outside. I'm like, well, everyone's wearing like summer
He
clothes.
seems fine.
He seems perfectly
I mean,
fine.
you got him hanging out there,
Like
but
yeah,
that's it.
and he
Yeah.
also never seems in peril. He's doing a little too much. Like I don't know. This is the other kind of problem I think with the movie is all the writing is very generic. And I don't even mean like generic bad
It's
writing.
like,
I mean like these are if I had to make a list of lines I've heard in movies, it's time for
oh,
Snow
there's
White and I to have a little chat.
the
Well, you
one.
just have princess problems. And I'm like, this has been said in every
Every movie.
single
Like there's a line
movie.
I think that he says when it's literally from The Princess Bride when he does like I'm the princess and he says his name, but then he's like I'm just my name,
Yeah,
not
I'm
my name,
Jonathan
princess.
Princess. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
Jonathan, not Jonathan. Which
Yeah.
like yeah, it's all very like there, and then they do a Lion King line also at one point. I was like, oh, so we're just gonna straight up
Strip it from
take
everything.
from everything, which
Yeah.
kind of robs it of any, fun.
Yeah,
It's
there's nothing here. I think this movie does a bad job of taking the few things that do really work about that 1937 film and bringing them to life. Like we don't feel the kindness or the whimsy of like her talking to the animals. Like that's a big piece of it. Like that's who Snow White is. We see her
I kept waiting
whistling
for
and
her to
having like,
whistle to the bird, and
yeah,
she never
exactly. And I'm
did.
like, that's a part of what this is. And so we don't really get that. And instead we get this sort of ham-fisted story about her like being the princess and taking over the kingdom and all that. And that's fine. You can have that in there, but I don't think you should have that in there at the expense of getting rid of like the kindness. Like we see a piece at the very beginning of the movie where she gives one of her townsfolks her crown or whatever, and we forget that piece until the very end. You're like, "Oh
Yeah,
yeah, she did do that 20 years ago."
and and whenever they do it, it's weird. Where she's like, "Well, we made apple pie for everybody," and you're like, "Okay,
Okay. I mean, like, sure.
sure." Kind of makes it sound like your mom and dad were maybe doing the bare minimum for the town.
Yeah.
If they just were they feeding them all the time? Was
Because
this
these
a
people
soup
still like they're
kitchen?
struggling. Like they seem like they're still having a hard time.
That's the other weird part. No one seemed prosperous in the beginning, and no one seemed that worse off. And I
No,
think this is one of the weird things that has happening in the Disney live action movies, and I can't put my finger on it. And I just keep being like, are we just afraid to like
to
freak
show
out
poor, to
kids
like
and
show,
show
yeah,
out? Yeah, because like even the Lion King, like Scar gets eaten by hyenas in that movie,
yeah.
and it's
Horrific.
crazy to
Yeah.
watch.
Yeah.
And like there's almost every animated one. Tarzan, Clayton gets like hung by a noose in that
Yeah.
shadow shot. Like they all have something that's like, whoa.
Yeah.
Or like dark and crazy and big
Yeah.
stuff you can do in animation. It's like the kind of things that Spider-Verse gets away with that like the Tom Holland movies aren't gonna really be able to
Hmm.
do as
Hmm.
well. Um, and it's funny when you just try to do it as a one-to-one, you almost lose. I saw a tweet, and I really should save people's names on tweets, but I didn't think I was going to bring this up. Someone was like, the problem with the live action Disney movies is that it's like if somebody was like, I'm going to go take a photograph of the Scream, the famous painting, and then it's just a photo of him doing like the Home Alone thing. You've stripped away everything that's made this painting
Hmm.
an amazing painting, and you've done nothing in photography that would set it apart.
Right.
And it's interesting that when you switch mediums, people often are just like, well, put the camera on sticks. Because like I said it to you in the theater, I was like, the biggest problem this movie has is actually like that Wicked was awesome.
Right.
And every musical scene in this feels so
Static.
static.
Yeah, like where
Or
we see
like
Wicked, like everything is like we're flipping the camera, we're doing everything else. Whereas this, we're just like, oh, we're just literally just putting this camera either static or putting it on a dolly and just moving it forwards and backwards.
And it's very hard to get like lost in that when you're just sort of
Yeah.
like standing still. But yeah, it's kind of a bummer because I just don't think that this movie really connected with any of the themes of the original, and I don't think it did a good enough job of giving it its new
Reinventing.
themes.
Yeah.
Because like even for all the conversations of like, well, this is going to be a story about her, and this prince is barely there. I was like, well, the prince is barely there.
Yeah.
And when he is there, he's like kind of a dick to
He
her.
is.
Like,
Yeah.
and so then even they're like, is it or is it not a love story? Whatever it is,
It
they have a
is.
whole. But we go from him being like, "You're a privileged whiny girl in a castle. You have princess problems. You're like everyone else, and I hate you." To this like dance
Dance
number where
number
she's
that then
like,
they
"Maybe everything I do is about you," and I'm like,
yeah.
"Oh, so we just went from like."
Yeah.
We like did a reverse Taylor Swift catalog where you went from being like, I'm an independent person to being like, it's
I
you
need a
and
man.
me.
Bring it's us. And it make because of that uncertainty, because of that flip-flop that sort of happens, when you get to the point where she does need the kiss from one's true love, I'm like, I feel like anybody, the dwarf, somebody could kiss her because I don't feel like he's the true love because nothing has been set up to
No,
say that
and
he's the true love.
if we're updating that piece of the movie, why is that piece of the movie still there?
I was thinking this in my head. I'm like, of all the things that probably should change, I would imagine that kissing a woman while she is asleep without her permission will probably be the one thing that, like, all right, we might want to change this piece.
And look, I get it. It's a kids' movie. And I will say, there were a lot of kids in that theater that were very engaged and seemed to be
Yeah,
having a very good
wearing their
time.
Snow White
So,
outfits.
yeah,
Yeah,
that was awesome. And I loved that. And a part of me was
yeah.
like, this is why this is
That's why
fun.
it's
This is
yeah,
why this is here for this new generation of people. And I can bitch and moan about what it was when I was alive in 1937. But but it is interesting because I do still am like, I wonder if it's going to last with them the way it lasted with anybody else. Because I'm sure there were plenty of animated movies I saw as a kid and then never watched again. And then there were the Toy Stories that even now I'm like, the Toy Stories.
What's funny to me, because I grew up in that 90s era, so like the Aladdin, Little Mermaid, Lion King, Beauty and the Beast are sort of that's my sweet spot of animated films. So that's also why I think those movies did slightly better at the box office because that those folks are parents now, and so it's a one-to-one, like they've shown their kids that, whereas Snow White's so far out. What I did not realize until I watched this movie is how close the stories are of Snow White and Sleeping Beauty are that I actively got them confused for
I
a
had the
long
same
time.
thing like twice in the theater. I was like, wait, is the Sleeping Beauty the True Love's kiss? And then I was like,
Yeah,
no, that's the inciting incident of Sleeping Beauty. That's the whole
that's the whole movie.
movie.
And
Yeah,
like I
it's
kept remembering, I was
interesting.
like, oh yeah, Maleficent is the one that turns into the dragon. Because that movie gets big at the end where it's like a dragon and you got three fairies. I'm like, these
Yeah.
stories are very similar. Um, And I just think I gravitated and enjoyed Sleeping Beauty more because I really dug the three fairies and I really liked the dragon that sort of turned in at the end that I kind of actively forgot outside of the witch turning into, the queen turning into the witch and feeding the apple. I forgot a great deal of Snow White besides the Seven Dwarfs. And so I just I don't know why halfway through I was like, oh, I actively just intertwine those two movies because they're so close to each other.
And it's interesting too, because I feel like in that same Disney era, when I was watching the Disney Channel or Radio Disney, like the dwarves kind of became their like iconography. Like almost
Mhm.
everything Disney had
Was
Dopey or
was
Doc or somebody on it.
a great deal of their clothing that used to be sold at Disneyland during
Yeah.
my era as a kid was all the dwarfs. Like it would be Happy Doc, Grumpy.
It
Like
was
they
really
would
the
sell.
Looney Tunes on the blue
Yeah,
jeans of
correct.
Disney.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
they were
a
cranking those guys out.
yeah, it's interesting that that kind of happened because you're right. I also kept being like, well, let's hang on. Am I confusing them? Is this a or am I just mixing Kingdom Hearts moments now in with
Right.
this and all
Because
the
they're all
crossover? Yeah.
intertwined. Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting place that Disney's at, and they do it so well with like Mickey. They did such a good job of making everyone love Mickey, and I can't tell you one thing about that character other than like he's nice.
Yeah. And
And they
he
kind
got
of
a red bow tie. And
and
that's
they
what I
did
got.
that same trick with like all their other characters. And now when we're kind of doing these remakes, I'm like, wait, hold on. Is this supposed to be who is this? What are we doing? Why was this relevant? Okay,
Yeah.
got it. Right, right, right. Um, and it definitely, I mean, for all of our, things about the movie and is it connecting and does it work anymore? Clearly, it did not find its audience with 43 million domestic, and I think just creeping into 80 for itself. And once again, we are sitting here talking about a movie where the budget ballooned
Was
into
hot.
the
Yeah.
200, whatever it was, 200 million, 150 million. They had to do reshoots, they had to wait all this time. No, it is interesting, as this article from AP News kind of brings up. Disney has had historically weak openings with Mufasa too, which went on
And
to
that had
make
legs. Yeah.
717
That had
million.
legs. Yeah.
And we have now seen this. You and I talked about it with Elemental. We talked about it with a lot of family movies, sort of post COVID, that end up having this longer tail.
They go for weeks after. Yeah.
So I don't know that the story's over, but
What's
certainly when you compare it to the other ones,
Yeah, like
their
Mermaid opened
openings,
out high. I think what hurts this a bit is the cinema score, which is probably the lowest that they've had since like even Dumbo had an A minus, I think, for cinema score. Like this
yeah.
has a B plus, which is just it's just that's a rough number. It doesn't seem like that bad, but in comparison to the rest, that's a low number to have. I think I tried to like you and I were deciding when we were going to go see it, and like I originally looked at my home theater for like a 7 o'clock Dolby screen at 8 p.m. or 7 o'clock Dolby, and I there were 10 seats that were sold, and the whole theater was pretty open, which is that's a bit insane for a Disney movie on opening weekend.
And the one we went to is similar. When I got the tickets, there weren't many, and then like a lot of people were there when we were
Yeah,
there. So I just don't know if like the consumer habits with families are different, if they're using the app or if they're just showing up and
them
buying.
showing
But
up. Yeah.
that is we did go to the Burbank Theater, which is in the middle of Hollywood, and everyone there is
Mhm.
a film goer. It's right near the Disney lot. 9 times out of 10, when we see anything there opening weekend, it's just
It's
asses to elbows. It's
packed. Yeah,
packed.
like it's insane.
So it definitely was different. And it is a shame, I think, that Disney is on this, like, whatever, get it over with. Like, there was no fun popcorn bucket. We didn't bother with a premiere.
It's a
It's,
fascinating. This one's fascinating in that I've never seen this happen before, where because of the sort of surrounding incidents that have heard occurred from both their leads, and what they sort of say and do outside of on red carpets and in interviews and whatnot, that they have actively hidden both of their leads, which is just mind-boggling to
yeah,
me.
it's a shame because I feel like they're really letting, how do I phrase this without also alienating people that don't agree with me? Um, they're letting a lot of the right-wing conservative people I don't agree with
Win.
and win, and a lot of, and I'm not saying all of them are bad, but they are just letting straight up trolls win. And
Yeah.
I'm sure there's trolls on both sides of that political spectrum, and it's sort of a bummer to me when you have like this whole lead up to this movie, which it's not great. I also wouldn't call it
No.
bad. I didn't leave mad or like
No.
angry. I wasn't making fun of it when we walked out. I just kind of walked out and was like, all right,
Okay.
like I'm sure if I had a kid and I plopped him in front of this for two
that
hours,
they'll eat this up.
yeah,
Yeah.
like,
And like I definitely left there. I was like, if they put money behind it, or at least put the two of them, even if I realize that they have opposing views on some of the stuff, so this is why you wouldn't put them together. But even if you put them separately out on red carpets, I don't know why you would do that to get an audience in to watch this
and
film.
hear me out. Maybe you sit down with all of your journalists and you go, hey guys, you can ask them any questions you want. We're not going to talk
Except for
about
this.
this. We're not going to
Correct.
talk about this. Remember when we used to do that? We'd prep
Yeah.
people
Like
and
you
people
would
would
put your
walk into an
PR person in there
interview.
and be like, hey,
Yeah.
these ones are off limits.
And
Don't
he would
bring
just
these
be
up.
like, hey,
Because if you do,
we're
we're just
promoting
gonna
a
walk
movie for
out.
children. Maybe don't
Right.
ask them about the election.
Correct.
Like
Because if you do,
maybe
we're just gonna leave.
Like,
Yeah.
yeah, it drives me crazy. It drives me crazy all the time now, where I'm like, I sit down, I'm like, I wonder what this person has to say about the movie. And they're like, so what do you think about this? And I'm like, I don't care.
Why are we here? I don't care
Like,
about that. Can
yeah,
you ask them about the film that they just filmed? Like that's what I'm
yeah,
here
we're at
for.
a red carpet. I think if I was ever a famous person and I was on a red carpet for a movie and someone was like, the world's on fire, I'd be like, right, good thing we're all going into a theater right now.
Yeah.
Like, I'm
Right.
not doing this with you. I'm not getting
Um,
suckered into this.
and it's just wild to me that they didn't lean, especially since Rachel's of the age of most of Generation Z. Like, I don't know why you wouldn't like, let's put this on TikTok. Like, let's do this. Let's have some of those songs go out so we can start creating this sort of vibe behind it. And they just dropped it, and which is mind-boggling considering how much money they poured into this film.
Yeah, I wonder how much of it was also just like, well, we poured all the money in already. We're like, we
We
can't.
can't give any more to this.
We're the Disney days of crank out no matter what is
Yeah.
over. Like we can't John Carter this one. Um,
Because it's weird. They did it the opposite. Like Mermaid had some issues going with it where they were like, hey, this woman, the Ariel is black. And Disney was like, shut up. We're gonna lean into this. We're gonna go all the way in. And they chose to ignore them there, but not here. And I don't know what the difference is between the two.
yeah, it's
Other than I think Little Mermaid has a better install base because it came out in that 90s,
right.
2000s run where there's an audience for it, where this one.
All right, everybody. Thanks for listening. That's our show today. As always, you can follow us at Hollywood ADI on TikTok, Twitter, and on YouTube, where Terrence does all the trailer reactions and TV show reviews. I'm on Twitter as always, Blake, and Terrence is at Terrence Tatum, and we will see everybody next time. There's no way that it froze while I was doing that.
It did. It did. But I was trying to like give a generic face so that
That
like
was,
whatever got
that's why I was like,
caught,
wow,
it
he's
was.
really holding still. And then right when I said it, I was like, oh, he didn't say later. He must have froze again. Oh my God.